The road wasn't supposed to be there. Captain Daniel Mercer stopped his pickup at the edge of the pasture and stared across the land he had left behind 11 months earlier. When he deployed overseas, this stretch of ranch had been quiet grazing ground, open grass, fence lines, and a dirt trail only his tractor used. Now a fresh gravel road cut straight through the middle of it. Bulldozers were parked beside survey flags. A contractor crew stood near a temporary sign hammered into the ground. The sign read, Redwood Valley HOA, Community Access Corridor Project. Mercer stepped out of the truck slowly. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the construction markers. The road ran almost half a mile across his property, a direct connection between two sides of the subdivision next door. He looked down at the construction permit stapled to the sign. Estimated development value, $480,000. A white SUV rolled up behind him. A sharply dressed woman stepped out, sunglasses resting on the edge of her hair. She glanced at the uniform duffel bag still sitting in Mercer's truck bed. Then she smiled politely. Captain Mercer, I assume. She extended a hand. Margaret Hale, president of the Redwood Valley HOA. She gestured casually toward the road cutting through his ranch. Your property made the most efficient route. Mercer didn't respond. Margaret continued, her voice calm and almost amused. You were deployed when the board approved it. Everything was done legally. She paused, then added one more line. You really should read your HOA paperwork before leaving town for a year. Mercer studied the permit again. The HOA approval stamp. The county planning signature. Something about it felt wrong. Because the one thing Mercer knew with absolute certainty was this. The HOA never had the authority to approve any road on his land. He folded the permit carefully and slipped it into his notebook. And one quiet question settled into his mind. If the HOA had no authority, who convinced the county that they did? If you enjoy stories where quiet patience defeats powerful systems, where one overlooked document can unravel an entire scheme, make sure you're subscribed. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from shouting or revenge. Sometimes it comes from the one person calm enough to read the paperwork everyone else ignored. Captain Daniel Mercer had spent most of his career solving problems that other people created. In the Army, logistics officers were rarely the ones in the spotlight. They weren't the loudest voices in the room, and they didn't chase recognition. Their job was simpler and far more dangerous to overlook. They studied systems, supply chains, movement schedules, documentation trails. Small details that could collapse an entire operation if someone ignored them. Mercer approached civilian life the same way. His ranch sat just outside a fast-growing residential development called Redwood Valley. The land had belonged to his family for 3 generations, long before the subdivision existed. The ranch wasn't enormous, but it was valuable land. Open pasture stretched across rolling ground, with a seasonal creek running along the southern edge. A gravel equipment trail ran through the property, used for tractors and livestock access. Beyond that trail was nothing but grass and fence line. Years earlier, when Redwood Valley was first built, the developer had created a homeowners association to manage the neighborhood. The HOA controlled the houses inside the subdivision. But Mercer's ranch had never been part of the development. His property sat directly beside the neighborhood boundary, close enough to see the houses from his pasture, but legally separate. For years, the relationship between Mercer and the HOA had been quiet. The board mostly focused on enforcing rules inside the neighborhood, landscaping standards, parking restrictions, maintenance issues. Mercer rarely thought about them. Then the board leadership changed. A woman named Margaret Hale became HOA president. Before joining the board, Hale had worked as a real estate broker specializing in suburban development. She understood one thing extremely well. Infrastructure increased property values. Within months of taking control, Hale began pushing a new idea for the neighborhood. She called it a community access corridor. The plan was simple on paper. A small road connecting two distant sections of the subdivision would reduce traffic congestion and increase home values across the neighborhood. But building the road inside the neighborhood itself would be expensive and complicated. There was a far easier route. A straight line. Directly across the edge of Mercer's ranch. When Mercer deployed overseas the following year, his house sat quiet behind the fence line. Mail collected in the lockbox near the driveway. His truck remained parked in the barn. The HOA board saw an opportunity. While Mercer was serving overseas, the board began working quietly with a local developer and survey contractor. Meeting minutes started mentioning something new. Not a proposal. Not a discussion. But a project. By the time Mercer's plane landed back in the United States nearly a year later, the paperwork had already moved through several offices. And according to those documents, the road across his ranch had already been approved. 2 days after Mercer returned to the ranch, the first official letter arrived. It came by certified mail, stamped with the return address of the Redwood Valley Homeowners Association. Mercer opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a formal notice printed on legal letterhead. The document informed him that his property had been designated as part of a community infrastructure access corridor. According to the letter, the HOA board had approved the project during a meeting held 8 months earlier. The approval allowed the association to coordinate with county planners to construct a secondary access road connecting two sections of the subdivision. Mercer read the page slowly. Then he reached the section that made the situation clear. The HOA claimed that his ranch property was subject to a development covenant authorizing infrastructure corridors benefiting the surrounding community. Because of that covenant, the board stated, the HOA had the authority to approve the road project even during his absence. Attached to the notice was an invoice. $18,400. The charges were labeled as land preparation and infrastructure coordination costs. At the bottom of the page, a warning appeared in bold text. Failure to cooperate with the development would result in escalating penalties and potential legal enforcement actions by the HOA. Mercer folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. He didn't call the HOA office. He didn't argue. Instead, he drove back to the construction site where the road was being built across his pasture. The contractor supervising the project recognized him immediately. Without hesitation, the man handed Mercer a copy of the county construction permit authorizing the road. The permit listed the project applicant as Redwood Valley HOA Development Committee. Mercer studied the document carefully. The permit carried a legitimate county planning department stamp, which meant the county had approved the project. Mercer photographed everything. The permit, the survey markers, the equipment parked along the new gravel road. Then he drove to the county planning office. A clerk retrieved the permit file and placed it on the counter. Inside were the HOA's submitted documents. A board resolution, a development proposal, and a supporting covenant amendment granting infrastructure authority. Mercer read the amendment slowly. Something about it felt strange. The language referenced a recorded covenant modification that supposedly extended HOA development authority beyond the neighborhood boundary. But Mercer had never seen that amendment before. And his family had owned the ranch long before the HOA ever existed. He left the building with copies of the permit file. Back in his truck, he opened the folder again and studied the amendment page more carefully. Near the bottom was a recording number referencing a county archive entry. If that amendment had truly been recorded, the HOA might have legal ground. But if it hadn't, then the entire road project might have been approved using paperwork that should never have been accepted. And Mercer intended to find out which one it was. Captain Mercer didn't respond emotionally to the HOA letter. He responded the way he had been trained to handle any complicated system problem. With documentation. The next morning he sat at the same kitchen table and drafted a formal written response. The letter was short, precise, and calm. He attached copies of 3 documents. His ranch deed, the county parcel boundary survey, The original property registration records. The message itself contained only one statement. The ranch property had never been part of the Redwood Valley HOA and was therefore not subject to HOA Development Authority. He requested written clarification explaining how the board believed they had jurisdiction over his land. Then he mailed the letter by certified post. The response arrived faster than he expected. 3 days later, a new envelope appeared in his mailbox. This one came from a law firm representing the HOA board. The tone was different. The attorney's letter explained that Mercer's ranch was still affected by a historic development covenant tied to the original land subdivision decades earlier. According to the HOA attorney, that covenant had later been amended to allow community infrastructure corridors benefiting surrounding residential development. The amendment, the letter stated, gave the HOA authority to approve the road project. The attorney concluded the message with a warning. If Mercer interfered with the project, the HOA would enforce its authority through financial penalties and legal action. Mercer finished reading the letter and placed it inside a growing folder of documents. Then another letter arrived. This one contained the first penalty notice. The HOA had begun charging a daily noncompliance fine. $1,200 per day. The stated reason was simple: obstruction of an authorized community infrastructure project. Mercer did not respond immediately. Instead, he began documenting everything. Every envelope. Every notice. Every invoice the HOA mailed. Meanwhile, construction on the road continued. Heavy trucks traveled across the gravel corridor through his pasture. Survey flags marked the route where paving would soon begin. Neighbors in the subdivision began talking about the project. Some believed Mercer had sold the land. Others assumed he had agreed to the road before leaving for deployment. The HOA newsletter reinforced that impression. In the next issue, Margaret Hale wrote that the board had successfully secured approval for a long-planned community access route. The article described the project as an improvement that would increase property values across Redwood Valley. Mercer's name appeared once in the article, not as the owner of the land, but as the landholder currently disputing the approved corridor. Another week passed. Another penalty notice arrived. The total charges had now reached $26,800. The letter warned that if Mercer continued resisting the project, the HOA would pursue a property lien against the ranch. Mercer finally contacted a local property law attorney. The attorney reviewed the HOA documents carefully. Most of the paperwork looked legitimate. The covenant amendment referenced in the HOA resolution appeared detailed and specific. But something about it bothered the attorney. The document looked like it had been copied from an older filing. The formatting didn't match other county-recorded covenants. The attorney leaned back in his chair. "Do you know when this amendment was recorded?" he asked. Mercer shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to find out." The attorney opened the county records database and began searching for the amendment reference number printed at the bottom of the page. But the system returned no immediate results, which meant one of two things was true. Either the amendment had been recorded under a different archive number, or the HOA had submitted a document that was never officially recorded at all. Meanwhile, the road construction continued across Mercer's ranch. And another HOA letter arrived the following week. This one was shorter. It simply informed Mercer that the HOA penalties had now exceeded $40,000. And if the situation continued much longer, the board would begin the legal process to secure a lien against his property. 2 weeks after the penalties passed $40,000, the HOA scheduled a community meeting. The agenda posted on the Redwood Valley website listed one major item: Infrastructure Update, Community Access Corridor Project. The meeting took place in the subdivision's clubhouse on a Thursday evening. Nearly every chair in the room was filled. Most of the residents were curious. Some were excited. The new road promised easier access between the north and south sections of the neighborhood. At the front of the room stood Margaret Hale, confident and composed behind the podium. A large projection screen displayed a map of the development. A bright red line cut straight across Mercer's ranch. Margaret explained the project calmly. The corridor will reduce travel time inside the neighborhood and increase property values for everyone here. A few people nodded. She continued. The county has already issued the construction permit, and our contractor is moving ahead on schedule. Then she paused. There has been some resistance from the neighboring landowner, Captain Mercer, who recently returned from overseas. Several heads turned. Mercer was sitting quietly in the back row. Margaret smiled politely. While we respect his service, the HOA's authority is clearly established through recorded covenants. A few quiet laughs moved through the room. The HOA attorney stepped forward next. He explained the legal position more aggressively. The association is fully within its rights to enforce development provisions tied to the original subdivision agreement. He added one more statement that felt directed toward Mercer. Personal objections cannot override legally approved infrastructure. Mercer remained seated. When the board opened the floor for questions, Margaret looked directly at him. Captain Mercer, she said smoothly. You're welcome to share your concerns with the community. The room fell quiet. Mercer stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue about the road. Instead, he asked a single question. When was the covenant amendment recorded with the county? The attorney answered quickly. It's part of the official subdivision documentation. Mercer nodded once. I understand that, he said calmly. But what year was it recorded? The attorney hesitated for a moment. Margaret stepped back to the microphone. The specific filing date isn't relevant to the project, she said. Mercer studied the room for a moment. Then he simply sat down. The meeting continued. The board celebrated the progress of the road project. Construction crews had already finished most of the gravel bays, and paving would begin within days. From the outside, the development looked like a success. 2 days later, Mercer received another letter from the HOA attorney. The tone had hardened. The document stated that Mercer now owed $63,200 in penalties for obstructing the corridor project. If the balance remained unpaid, the HOA would file a property lien against his ranch. The letter ended with a final warning. The association would pursue all legal remedies necessary to enforce the development agreement. Outside Mercer's window, the road construction continued. Dump trucks moved back and forth across the pasture. Workers laid fresh gravel across the final section of the corridor. From the perspective of the neighborhood, the project was nearly finished. And the board believed they had already won. But later that same evening, Mercer received a phone call from his attorney. The attorney had finally found something in the county archive search. Something small, but strange. The recording number printed on the covenant amendment did exist in the county database. Just not for the document the HOA claimed. Which meant one thing was becoming increasingly possible. The entire authority the HOA relied on for the road project might be built on a document that had never actually been recorded. Late that night, Mercer sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of construction trucks finishing work on the road outside. The folder of HOA documents lay open in front of him. Letters. Penalty notices. Legal warnings. The most recent total sat printed in bold numbers across the top page. $63,200. Outside his window, the new road cut across the dark pasture like a pale scar through the grass. Cars had already started using it. For a moment, Mercer allowed himself to consider the possibility that the system had already moved too far to stop. The road was built. The county had approved the permit. The HOA had lawyers and paperwork backing every step. Even his own attorney had admitted the case looked complicated. Mercer leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. During deployments overseas, he had seen operations fail because someone trusted the wrong piece of information. One small assumption placed in the wrong system. And everything that followed built on top of that mistake. That was how systems collapsed. Not from force. From unchecked paperwork. He pulled the covenant amendment page from the folder again and laid it flat on the table. At first glance, the document looked official. Typed language. Signature block. Reference number. But the more Mercer studied it, the more something felt wrong. The formatting didn't match the original covenant filings. Older county records always carried a recording stamp showing the exact date the document entered the archive. This page had no stamp. Only the printed reference number. Mercer opened the county database search on his laptop and typed the number again. The result appeared instantly. But it wasn't the covenant amendment. It was an unrelated zoning document filed years earlier for a different parcel entirely. Mercer stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair. Because if the amendment was never recorded with the county, it never became legally enforceable, which meant the authority the HOA relied on might not exist at all. Outside, a truck drove across the new road. Mercer looked back at the amendment page and realized something important. If the HOA had built the entire project on a document that didn't legally exist, then the biggest mistake they made wasn't building the road. It was assuming no one would ever check the paperwork closely enough to notice. Late that night, Mercer sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of construction trucks finishing work on the road outside. The folder of HOA documents lay open in front of him. Letters. Penalty notices. Legal warnings. The most recent total sat printed in bold numbers across the top page. $63,200. Outside his window, the new road cut across the dark pasture like a pale scar through the grass. Cars had already started using it. For a moment, Mercer allowed himself to consider the possibility that the system had already moved too far to stop. The road was built. The county had approved the permit. The HOA had lawyers and paperwork backing every step. Even his own attorney had admitted the case looked complicated. Mercer leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. During deployments overseas, he had seen operations fail because someone trusted the wrong piece of information. One small assumption placed in the wrong system. And everything that followed built on top of that mistake. That was how systems collapsed. Not from force. From unchecked paperwork. He pulled the covenant amendment page from the folder again and laid it flat on the table. At first glance, the document looked official. Typed language. Signature block. Reference number. But the more Mercer studied it, the more something felt wrong. The formatting didn't match the original covenant filings. Older county records always carried a recording stamp showing the exact date the document entered the archive. This page had no stamp. Only the printed reference number. Mercer opened the county database search on his laptop and typed the number again. The result appeared instantly. But it wasn't the covenant amendment. It was an unrelated zoning document filed years earlier for a different parcel entirely. Mercer stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair. Because if the amendment was never recorded with the county, it never became legally enforceable, which meant the authority the HOA relied on might not exist at all. Outside, a truck drove across the new road. Mercer looked back at the amendment page and realized something important. If the HOA had built the entire project on a document that didn't legally exist, then the biggest mistake they made wasn't building the road. It was assuming no one would ever check the paperwork closely enough to notice. The next morning, Mercer's attorney contacted the county recorder's office. He requested something very specific. Not the covenant amendment itself, but the official recording log tied to the document number printed at the bottom of the amendment page. County records offices kept detailed archives. Every document that became legally enforceable had to pass through that system. If the amendment truly existed, it would appear in the index. By afternoon, the recorder's office called back. The clerk had searched the archive database twice. Then she confirmed something unusual. The document number printed on the covenant amendment did exist in the system, but it did not belong to any HOA covenant. It belonged to a completely unrelated filing, a minor zoning adjustment recorded for a commercial parcel several miles away, which meant the amendment the HOA submitted with their road application had borrowed a recording number from an entirely different document. Mercer's attorney requested one more verification. Is there any covenant amendment filed under Redwood Valley that authorizes infrastructure corridors outside the subdivision boundary? The clerk searched again. Nothing appeared. No amendment. No modification. No filing granting the HOA authority to extend development beyond the neighborhood. The clerk printed certified copies of the archive results and stamped them for legal use. Later that evening, Mercer and his attorney reviewed the documents together. The folder on the table was thin. Just a few pages. But those pages showed something extremely important. The HOA had presented the county with an amendment that was never officially recorded. And because the county trusted the HOA's paperwork, the road permit had been approved using that document as proof of authority. Mercer closed the folder slowly, because the implication was now unavoidable. If the amendment never existed in the county archive, then the HOA never had the legal authority to approve the road across his ranch, which meant the next public hearing wasn't going to be about penalties or fees. It was going to be about whether the HOA had misled the county into approving a project they had no power to authorize. 2 weeks later, the county planning review hearing was scheduled. The room was smaller than the HOA meeting hall, but far more serious. This wasn't a neighborhood discussion. It was an official administrative review. At one side of the table sat the Redwood Valley HOA board. Margaret Hale sat in the center with the association's attorney beside her. Several board members shuffled through thick folders of documents. Across the room sat Captain Mercer and his attorney. Mercer's folder was noticeably thinner. Just a few pages. But those pages had been carefully prepared. The planning officer opened the session and reviewed the purpose of the hearing. The county had received a request to confirm the legal authority used to approve the Redwood Valley Access Corridor project. The officer turned to the HOA attorney. Please explain the association's authority for approving construction across the Mercer property. The attorney stood confidently. He explained that the HOA's authority came from a covenant amendment tied to the original subdivision agreement. The amendment extended infrastructure authority beyond the neighborhood boundary when necessary for community development. He placed the amendment document on the table for the county officials. This amendment was submitted with the project application, he said. It forms the legal basis for the corridor approval. The planning officer nodded and made a note. Then he looked toward Mercer's attorney. Do you wish to respond? Mercer's attorney stood slowly. We do. He placed a small folder on the table and slid it toward the planning officer. Before discussing the road project, he said calmly, we believe the county should confirm whether the amendment cited by the HOA was ever officially recorded. The room grew quiet. The planning officer looked at the amendment page again. Then he turned to the county clerk seated beside him. Can we verify the recording number printed on this document? The clerk typed the number into the county archive system. The computer screen reflected softly in her glasses as she read the result. A few seconds passed. Then she spoke carefully. That recording number exists in the county archive. The HOA attorney nodded immediately. Exactly. But the clerk continued. It belongs to a zoning adjustment filing for a commercial parcel on North Ridge Road. The room fell silent. The planning officer leaned forward. Are you saying the number does not correspond to a covenant amendment? The clerk shook her head. There is no amendment recorded under that number. Mercer's attorney calmly opened the certified documents from the recorder's office. These are official archive logs from the county records department, he explained. They confirm that no amendment granting infrastructure authority to the HOA was ever recorded. The planning officer studied the documents carefully. Then he looked back toward the HOA board. Margaret Hale remained perfectly still. The HOA attorney quickly responded. The amendment exists, he insisted. It was approved years ago. The planning officer raised one eyebrow. Approval is not the same as recording, he said. In this county, a covenant amendment has no legal authority until it is officially recorded with the recorder's office. He turned back to the clerk. Has any amendment granting infrastructure authority to Redwood Valley been recorded at any time? The clerk searched again. No, sir. A quiet tension filled the room. Mercer said nothing. He simply watched the documents pass across the table. The planning officer looked back at the HOA attorney. So the road permit application submitted by the HOA relied on this amendment for authority? Yes, the attorney admitted. And that amendment was never recorded with the county? The attorney hesitated. The silence in the room answered the question before he could. The planning officer leaned back in his chair. Which means the HOA had no legally recorded authority to approve development outside its covenant boundary. He tapped the road permit file. And the county approved this project based on documentation that appears to have no legal standing. Margaret Hale finally spoke. The amendment was adopted by the board, she said carefully. But it was never filed? The planning officer asked. Margaret did not answer. Mercer's attorney spoke calmly. Without a recorded amendment, the HOA covenant contains no language authorizing infrastructure corridors beyond subdivision property. He gestured toward Mercer. Which means the association had no authority to approve a road across Mr. Mercer's land. The planning officer closed the permit file slowly. Then he spoke with deliberate clarity. If the amendment was never recorded, the county approved this project under a false assumption of authority. He looked at Margaret Hale. Did the HOA verify the amendment's recording before submitting this application? No one at the HOA table answered. For several seconds the room remained completely still. Then the planning officer wrote something on the permit file. This project approval will be placed under immediate administrative review. He looked directly at the board. If the authority cited in the application does not legally exist, the county will have to determine whether the permit itself remains valid. Mercer sat quietly. He had not raised his voice. He had not argued. He had simply brought the right documents. And now the realization was spreading across the room. The entire road project, the construction, the penalties, the lien, had been built on a document that had never legally existed in the first place. But the final consequences would not be decided in that room. The county would soon announce its ruling publicly. And when that decision arrived, the HOA board would finally understand the full cost of approving a road across land they never had authority to touch. 3 weeks after the planning review, the county scheduled a formal public hearing. This time the room was much larger. Residents from the Redwood Valley subdivision filled the seats. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood that the road project might not be as secure as the HOA board had claimed. At the front of the room sat the County Planning Commission. Stacks of documents covered the long table in front of them. On one side sat the Redwood Valley HOA board. Margaret Hale was still composed, but the confidence she carried at the earlier HOA meeting had faded slightly. The board attorney whispered quietly to her as they reviewed their papers. Across the room sat Captain Mercer and his attorney. Mercer had brought the same small folder he had carried into the previous review hearing. The planning commissioner opened the meeting. This hearing concerns the approval of the Redwood Valley Access Corridor project and the authority used to authorize construction across property belonging to Captain Daniel Mercer. The commissioner paused before continuing. During the previous administrative review, questions were raised about the covenant amendment submitted by the HOA as proof of development authority. The room became quiet. The commissioner turned toward the county recorder's representative. Please summarize your findings. The recorder's representative stood. The document submitted by the HOA references a covenant amendment granting the association authority to approve infrastructure corridors beyond the subdivision boundary. She held up a certified copy of the archive search. However, our office has confirmed that this amendment was never recorded in the county record system. Murmurs spread through the audience. Several residents exchanged confused looks. The commissioner continued. Because the amendment was never recorded, it has no enforceable legal standing under county property law. He opened the road permit file. The county planning department approved the corridor permit based on that amendment. He looked directly at the HOA board. Without that amendment, the association had no authority to authorize construction on Mr. Mercer's land. Margaret Hale leaned toward the microphone. Our board adopted the amendment years ago, she said. It was approved internally. The commissioner responded calmly. Internal approval does not create legal authority unless the document is recorded with the county. The HOA attorney attempted to intervene. Even if the amendment was not recorded properly, the road project has already been completed, he argued. The community now relies on that corridor. The commissioner nodded slowly. That fact has been considered. He turned toward Mercer's attorney. Would the property owner like to speak? Mercer stood. The room watched him carefully. Many of the residents had only heard about the situation through HOA newsletters or community emails. Most of them had never heard Mercer speak. He approached the microphone calmly. I don't have much to add, he said. He placed a single document on the table in front of the commissioners. The county archive logs confirmed that the amendment used to authorize the road was never recorded. He paused briefly. Which means the authority the HOA relied on never legally existed. The room remained silent. Mercer then delivered the only line he had prepared. Authority only exists when the document creating it actually exists. The sentence settled across the room. The commissioner nodded slowly. Thank you, Captain Mercer. He turned back to the planning board. After several moments of quiet discussion, the commissioner read the county's ruling. Based on the findings of the county recorder's office and the absence of a legally recorded covenant amendment, the Redwood Valley HOA lacked authority to approve infrastructure construction across the Mercer property. He continued reading. As a result, the county permit issued for the access corridor was approved under an invalid legal assumption. He closed the permit file. The permit is therefore revoked. Gasps and whispers moved through the audience. But the ruling continued. The HOA's enforcement penalties issued to Captain Mercer are based on the same invalid authority and therefore carry no legal standing. The commissioner looked directly at the HOA board. The lien filed against the Mercer property must be immediately withdrawn. The HOA attorney leaned forward quickly. What about the road that has already been constructed? He asked. The commissioner answered without hesitation. Because the permit has been revoked, the corridor currently exists as an unauthorized development across private property. He paused before continuing. The county will begin administrative proceedings to determine the required remediation. In simple terms, that meant the road could not legally remain open without Mercer's permission. The board members sat frozen in their seats. The project they had celebrated only weeks earlier had just collapsed in front of the entire community. The commissioner closed the session. The county will issue a written order detailing the next steps. Residents slowly began leaving the room, many of them whispering to each other. For months the HOA had described the road as a success. Now everyone in the room understood something very different. The entire project had been built on paperwork that should never have been accepted in the first place. Within days of the public hearing, the county issued its formal written order. The document was precise and direct. First, the planning department officially revoked the Redwood Valley Access Corridor permit. Because the HOA had relied on a covenant amendment that was never recorded, the permit approval had been issued under a false assumption of authority. Without that authority, the HOA had never possessed the legal right to approve construction across Mercer's property. The second section of the order addressed the financial actions taken by the HOA. Every penalty the association had issued to Mercer, the daily fines, the enforcement charges, the administrative costs, was declared invalid. Those penalties had only existed because the HOA believed Mercer was obstructing an authorized development. Since the development itself had no legal basis, the penalties had no standing either. The county required the HOA to withdraw the property lien immediately. Mercer's attorney confirmed the filing 2 days later. The lien against the ranch was removed from the county record system. But the consequences did not stop there. Because the road construction had been completed without proper authority, the county classified the corridor as an unauthorized development across private land. Under county regulations, that meant the party responsible for the construction, in this case, the HOA and its contractor, was responsible for resolving the violation. The board had 2 options. They could negotiate directly with Mercer for a legal easement allowing the road to remain. Or they could remove the development and restore the property to its previous condition. The HOA board requested a meeting with Mercer. It took place in a quiet conference room at the county building. Margaret Hale sat across the table from him with the association's attorney. The tone of the conversation was very different from the one she had used during the community meeting weeks earlier. She explained that removing the road would be expensive. Extremely expensive. The contractor had already been paid for construction, paving, and drainage work. Restoring the pasture could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The attorney asked Mercer whether he would consider granting an easement to allow the road to remain. Mercer listened quietly. Then he asked a simple question. What happens if the road stays? The attorney explained that the HOA would need to purchase a legal right-of-way across the property. That right would require a formal land agreement approved by Mercer and recorded with the county. Mercer thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. No. Margaret Hale looked surprised. Mercer continued calmly. The board built the road without permission. He paused. Now the board can remove it the same way. Within weeks, construction equipment returned to the ranch. But this time the machines were not building the road. They were tearing it out. Asphalt was broken and hauled away. The gravel base beneath it was removed section by section. Drainage pipes were pulled from the ground. Truckloads of soil were brought in to fill the corridor. By the end of the month, the pasture looked almost the way it had before the project began. The HOA board faced another problem as the situation became public. Residents inside the subdivision had been told the corridor would increase property values. Instead, the project had cost the association enormous legal fees and restoration costs. Community frustration grew quickly. At the next HOA election meeting, several board members declined to run for their positions again. Margaret Hale resigned before the vote. The association quietly hired a new management company to stabilize the board. Mercer watched most of this unfold from a distance. He did not attend the HOA meetings. He did not make public statements. He simply continued restoring the sections of pasture where construction equipment had damaged the land. The road that once cut across the ranch slowly disappeared. And the penalties that had once threatened Mercer's property vanished along with it. The entire conflict had started with a single document the HOA assumed no one would examine closely. But in the end, that one missing record had undone everything the board tried to build. By the end of the summer, the pasture looked almost the way it had before the construction crews arrived. Fresh grass began pushing through the soil where the gravel corridor had once run. The scar across the land slowly faded back into open field. From a distance, it was difficult to tell that a paved road had ever crossed the ranch at all. Life around Redwood Valley became quiet again. The HOA board rarely mentioned the project anymore. New leadership focused on routine neighborhood issues instead of expansion plans. A few residents from the subdivision occasionally stopped by the fence line while Mercer worked. Some offered quiet apologies. Others simply nodded in respect. Mercer never held the situation against them. Most of the neighborhood had believed the board's paperwork. That was the problem with systems built on documents. When the paperwork looked official, people rarely questioned it. One evening Mercer stood near the old fence line and looked across the restored pasture. The land was quiet again. The road was gone. and the document that once justified it had never existed in the first place. Mercer picked up his tools and walked back toward the barn, leaving the pasture exactly the way it was meant to be.